The 90s in the NBA was one hell of a ride, and I believe that a lot of the most popular basketball shoes of all time, not named Air Jordans, existed in that era. So in this episode, we're going to take a look at the iconic designs and the athletes who wore them, this time on Fire Footwear. Welcome to Fire Footwear, everybody. As always, this is your host, Matt Frates, and I hope that this finds you well. And as always, I'd like to thank you for giving your sliver of time in your life to this show. It means a lot to me. I hope that you've learned something over the last couple of weeks, and I've had a lot of fun putting this stuff together. Lately, I've been thinking a lot about the history of sneakers, and while I think that it's important and I think that people should know about it, I also understand that maybe it's not something that you look for in all of your sneaker podcasts. I think a lot of people want to talk about pickups and different things, and I will continue to do that for you. But this week, I want to continue down this line of thinking about history, and we talked at the top of the show about 90s basketball. To give you a little bit of insight into my life, 90s basketball is what I grew up on, and I think for the vast majority of people who listen to this podcast, not all of you, but a vast majority, I think a lot of you are in the age range for which 90s basketball was very, very prevalent. And while the sneaker game is certainly defined by a lot of different things today, and we've been over some of those things from silhouettes to people over the years, I think that 90s basketball had it had such a mark on sneaker culture that it's difficult to deny. And I thought it was really important for us to visit all of this because I think that there are so many shoes that we may have forgotten about in thinking about all these shoes, because nowadays you see retro after retro after retro, and I wonder sometimes, let's take the Air Max 180 for example, how many people know the history of it? How many people know how many times it's retroed? And for some people that went for it, or did they not go for it because they had no idea what it was? Let's think about 90s basketball, or even just the 90s in general, but the 90s were really a transformative decade for the NBA if you think about it. Obviously, it included the prime and the rise of Michael Jordan, but if you think about it, it was a time that was defined by dynamic play, a lot of larger-than-life personalities, and here's the key, a lot of intense rivalries. If you really think back to the 90s, so many teams hated each other, and I don't know if that exists in the same way today. But the league at that time saw the rise of so many what they considered global superstars, and honestly, I think basketball shoes became more than just performance gear then. They started to become a fashion statement and truly a cultural phenomenon. And we're going to look at a bunch of shoes. And I said we're going to exclude the Air Jordan because I think we all know what the history of the Air Jordan was. And I think that we all know that the Air Jordan is going to be included in a list like this. But I want to give the shine to other companies. I want to give the shine to other shoes, other athletes, because Michael Jordan's easy. That's low-hanging fruit. I think it's important for us to look into some other brands, some other shoes, and some other athletes, so maybe we can jog our memory, or when a shoe comes out that you've never heard of or think you've never heard of, perhaps if you have listened to this episode, you will go back and say, oh, now I have a little bit of context. So let's start off with Converse. Now, Converse is interesting because Converse is obviously a brand that is now owned by Nike, but for the longest time, Converse was sort of a mainstay in sneakers, and I think that's undeniable. We talked about the Chuck Taylor All-Star. That doesn't happen if not for Converse. But when I say Converse now, do people think of basketball? Or did people think of basketball ever when it came to Converse after, let's say, the 1970s? I would say the answer today would be no. But in 1993, I think they had somewhat of a hit on their hands by having the Converse Aero Jam. Now, this was related to Larry Johnson. Larry Johnson was a two-time NBA All-Star. He won Rookie of the Year in 1992, so the year before, and now Converse is trying to get the signature athlete, a guy who's coming off a heater in 1992. He was a Charlotte Hornet. He was a New York Knick. I think he even went to the NBA Finals with the Knicks. I want to say 1999 maybe. He was powerful. He had a lot of charisma. And he was also in a bunch of iconic commercials, those grandmama advertising commercials, you know them. And I think that this shoe attached to this man being released in 93, designed for him specifically, I think that it was their attempt at getting into the popularity of basketball shoes in the 90s. I think it symbolized his influence both on and off the court because, again, this is when we're starting to get shoes that sort of mimic personalities, very similar to what we get today. It was reactive in its cushioning. It had a bold look, an innovative design. And I really feel like in Converse's history, this is probably one of the most celebrated models, even though they don't celebrate it as much as they should today. But let's not mistake that Converse was a player in the 90s. And so that is what Converse brought to the table then. Another brand that I think people associated with athletics, or at least associated with sort of streetwear back in the day, that's not one that you hear a lot about today, is Fila. Now, I remember Fila very, very vividly. I remember people wearing the tracksuits. If you go back and watch Sopranos, you probably see a lot of Fila in there. And in the mid-90s, they were a major player. And the athlete that they attached themselves to was Grant Hill. Grant Hill was a player who came into the league about the time Michael Jordan was exiting the league, and there were a lot of high expectations on this guy. And when you look back at his career, he's a great broadcaster now, but when you look back at his career, it was marred by injuries. I think many people would say that his career trajectory changed because he just couldn't stay healthy enough to have that transcendent career that everybody thought that he was going to have. But let's make no mistake, he was a 7-time NBA All-Star. He was professional. He was really, really good. He played for the Pistons, played for the Magic, co-rookie of the year in 1995, Basketball Hall of Famer in 2018. He still had a legendary career, just not transcendent, just not generational the way that we thought. But in 1996, he was at the height of his powers, and you see a trend here because Fila and Converse both attaching themselves to the reigning Rookie of the Year. Now, this shoe had a sleek design, and it was known for its support. A lot of the 90s shoes in general were very bulky because they were going for support, but it was very, very popular. And I think because Fila needed something to establish themselves, they really needed to get into the game in a very meaningful way. And in order to do that, you had to attach yourself to somebody that wasn't Michael Jordan. And Grant Hill was that guy. For Grant Hill, a guy that I think had a ton of spotlight, that people really loved to watch because I think they wanted to watch him for the hope that he represented. Fila was the brand that they saw on his feet, and that was kind of a big deal. Now, Fila obviously didn't make it in the long run in terms of being a mainstay as a main player in the sneaker game, but I think that they did a pretty good job, and they had a great run with Grant Hill in the mid-90s. Now let's move on to Adidas. Now, Adidas is interesting because Adidas is obviously having a resurgence in terms of their basketball line with Anthony Edwards. But in the 90s, I don't think they were synonymous with basketball the same way people associated Nike at the time. However, 1997, here comes Kobe Bryant. Kobe Bryant, much like Grant Hill, but I think in a different way, had Michael Jordan written all over him. Now, Kobe was coming straight out of high school. This was during the time when players were coming straight out of high school, before there were any mandatory 1 year in college, things like that, one and done. Now, Kobe was coming out with a ton of expectations, but Kobe came out in a time in which Michael Jordan really was phasing out of the game. They obviously overlapped for a couple of years, had a famous interaction in the All-Star game, but Kobe was seen as the future. And this was a little bit before LeBron, but you got to remember, Kobe Bryant was 18 years old when he came into the league. Kobe Bryant's resume as a basketball player speaks for itself. Obviously, All-Star games, NBA champions, scoring titles, MVPs. He's 4th all-time in career points. He obviously was posthumously put into the Basketball Hall of Fame. You say Kobe and it speaks for himself, but I think today people think of Kobe and they think of his Kobe line with Nike. But prior to that, he was an Adidas athlete, and he had 2 shoes, the Adidas EQT Elevation and the Adidas Crazy 8. Now, there were some other Adidas Crazies as well, but all of these shoes were part of Kobe's coming out party as an athlete. This was prior to getting with Shaq, prior to winning some titles, and these shoes are now being given the love now that Kobe is no longer with us. But if you go back and look at them, they definitely made their mark. I mean, Kobe wore them in dunk contests, and he wore them in an all-star game. And this was a guy who, much like Grant Hill, who had a bright future, he was probably the brightest star at the time. And I'm talking about young stars that had the most expectations on them. And they took some chances with technology. And these models now, while you look back at them and think, okay, maybe they don't match the same aura as the run that Kobe has had with Nike, but this is where it started. And this is where Kobe got his start in the sneaker game. And I think when you look back on it, there's a reason why Kobe's with Nike are so good. And I think Kobe or the Kobe's, at least with Adidas, kind of scratched the surface of that. But go back and learn the history. If you have a bunch of Kobe's in your collection, you owe it to these Adidas shoes to go back and give them the love that they deserve, because for certain, Kobe Bryant put Adidas on the map in a big, big way, to the point that I think they are what they are today. Once upon a time in the 1980s, Reebok was huge, and they were huge for aerobics and their Club C's and a ton of those types of shoes that women really were seen wearing all the time. But when you talk about the 90s, you cannot talk about 90s basketball without talking about Reebok in general. And there are a couple shoes that come to mind. First of all, in terms of athletes, Shaquille O'Neal was the biggest, and I mean that in a physical sense, player in the 1990s and even the 2000s when he was still winning championships. But when he was at LSU, he was seen as the next Bill Russell, like a real dominant force down there. And coming up with Penny Hardaway, obviously those Magic teams going to the NBA Finals, Shaq had something that was a little different. But in 1995, he added to that different legacy by having the Shaqnosis, the Reebok Shaqnosis. And if you've ever seen this shoe, the second I say the Shaqnosis, you can see it in your mind. And it was made to look like the Twilight Zone. Obviously, Shaquille O'Neal had an illustrious Hall of Fame career, ridiculous career. But these shoes, and one thing that somebody pointed out to me recently, is that there was only ever one colorway of this shoe. They were bold. And the thing is, they were not only bold because Shaq was bold, they were bold to make a statement on the television screen. And they did that. When you saw them on the screen, you thought to yourself, I have to have those. What are those? That's great marketing. And the Shaqnosis really did that. The Shaqnosis also did a great thing in the fact that it was so coveted because it was so rare. Because there wasn't a lot of them. Think about today, how many colorways of shoes come out? One colorway of the Shaqnosis. That adds a little bit of mystery to the shoe, and it also adds to the mystique, and I think that's a wonderful thing. Now, Allen Iverson was another guy coming out in 1996 who had a high future. Probably one of the most revered scorers of all time. He was an 11-time All-Star, won the MVP in 2001, went to the NBA Finals against Kobe Bryant with the 76ers in 2001, obviously a Hall of Famer. But the Reebok question, and why does that make sense? Allen Iverson's nickname was the answer. So obviously you have the question, the answer, and it just worked. It had the patent leather on it, that little toe cap, the white and the red, it stood out. And it stood out because, in my opinion, it was designed to be like Allen Iverson, unlike anything else that was on the court. A lot of people will like to say that Allen Iverson played me basketball, but on the teams that he played for, 100% had to. And I think that Allen Iverson, the shoe, everything all fit together. And that's the other thing too, is Allen Iverson had a ton of moments in his NBA career, and he was doing it wearing the Reebok question. And so you can't really mention Reebok without mentioning the question. It's awesome. But the one that predates all of those in the 90s, one of my personal favorites of all time, the Pump Omni Light, 1991. D. Brown played for the Boston Celtics, reliable player, not a Hall of Famer. However, he was the guy that Reebok wanted to attach the pump to. And I can remember that All-Star game, watching it with my dad and watching him bend over and pump the tongues of those shoes and go and make these ridiculous dunks. When you're a kid, you think that's real. And the Reebok pump did something that I don't think the Air Jordan ever did. And maybe people thought that they could fly like Michael Jordan, but when you saw them physically pump it up, when you talk about being 10, 11, 12 years old, even a little bit younger, man, that image just gives you this want for this shoe. It was unlike anything that had come before. Realistically, as a 40-year-old man now, I know that it didn't do anything. But in that moment, it did, and I think that's pretty awesome. And so that's one of my favorite shoes of all time. It was the shoe that got me hooked on sneakers way back in the day. I wished I owned one, and Reebok definitely hit a home run there. And last with Reebok, we have to talk about Shawn Kemp, the Kamikaze. The Kamikaze 2 specifically. Shawn Kemp was, man, he was just different. He was amazingly large, amazingly athletic. We all know him for playing with the Sonics. They went to an NBA Finals. He was nicknamed the Rain Man, and that's just an amazing nickname. And these shoes 100% match that. The zigzag pattern, it was bold. It obviously stood out on the court, and it really reflected his power and his athletic playing style. It was just such a different looking shoe. He played aggressive. The shoe looked aggressive. And that's one that I haven't seen a whole lot of retros of, but I think Shawn Kemp should get that love because he was amazing and the shoe was amazing. And now we move on to Nike. Now, Nike will forever probably have a stronghold as the #1 basketball shoe brand of all time. Let's start in 1995. We mentioned his teammate, Shaq. This is Penny Hardaway and the Air Penny 1 in 1995. This shoe has been getting a ton of love the last couple of years, and rightly so. It was nearly perfect, and it really matched everything that he was all about. The Zoom Air cushioning, unbelievable. And I know that Penny Hardaway gravitated toward the Foamposite a little bit later, but the Air Penny 1 was incredible, and it's getting a lot of retros, probably too many retros, but it still deserves that kind of a love because Penny was a guy, much like Grant Hill, whose career was derailed by injuries, but his star didn't get as bright as Grant Hill's did, in my opinion. But this shoe was the cornerstone of his career, and I think is just an amazing addition to 90s basketball. Scottie Pippen, probably best known as the best second man of all time, and that is no shade at Scottie Pippen whatsoever, but the Nike Up-Tempo, unbelievable shoe. Honestly though, like, how do you describe this shoe without describing how bold it is with that air on the side? I mean, that's iconic. You can see that from anywhere. You talk about the Hardens, you talk about these shoes that are easily recognizable on the court. That one, easily recognizable. We've even seen a ton of collaborations with this shoe over the years. It's one that's kind of become popular out there on the streets. It's like a general release, and I think that that's really cool, and that started here with Scottie Pippen. So when Scottie Pippen complains about not getting enough love, that shoe, the Up-Tempo, got plenty of love, and that's why it's included here. Jason Kidd, a guy who has gotten the Dallas Mavericks to the NBA Finals, but he was a Hall of Fame point guard and was just an incredible passer. And he was known for wearing the Zoom Flight 95. Now, this shoe obviously was very futuristic, had carbon fiber details and things like that. And at the time, it kind of pushed boundaries. And using Zoom Air cushioning, of course, this was very, very popular at the time, but it also was very lightweight because, again, he played a fast pace. Now, it looks slow compared to what guys do now, but he needed a shoe that kind of matched that. And that was another really, really cool one. That's probably one on this list that if you had to go back and look it up, that's probably one of the ones you have to look up because it wasn't one that was flashy. It didn't get a ton of love and hasn't gotten a ton of love recently, but it's one you should go back and look at because it's pretty fire. Everybody has to know who Charles Barkley is at this point, and they have retroed some of these colorways, the original colorways of the Air Max CB34. This was 1995. They obviously had a couple of them, but this one, Charles Barkley, just like he is today, was very loud on the court. Obviously was very, very talented, and the shoe really matched the way that he was. Like, this shoe took chances. It was bold. It didn't look like anything else. And when I say aggressive, I think you know what I mean. Like, when you look at it, it's not something that gives you a pleasing look. Like, it is just something that really was hard, and it was something that matched his intensity and the way that he was. Unforgiving on the court, unforgiving in his criticism, and that shoe did that. We talked about this on Sneak Diss when Greg was giving his list, but the Air Zoom Flight Gary Payton, the glove. This is a shoe that was very different, again, with that lace shroud. It obviously had the handprint on it, as Greg talked about. Gary Payton was known as the glove for a lot of reasons, and it fit that way. And this shoe was a snug fit. It was sleek, but yet at the same time was also bulky, if that makes sense. And it really fit his playing style. It fit the way that he was. He was unabashedly cocky out there. And I think the shoe kind of meets that standard as well, because that was just the way that he was. And Gary Payton is a guy who never won an NBA title, but deserves a lot of credit because he was an amazing, amazing player. And I think that, honestly, he's one of the best guards to ever play this game. My opinion, of course. How could we not include Dennis Rodman on this list? The Nike Air Shake Destruct. And I don't even know if that's the way to say it. Destruct, whatever it is, silent N. But the Worm, rebounding champion, rebounding virtuoso. And this shoe was interesting because when you go back and look at it, it has what appears to be a reverse swoosh on it. He has made the claim recently that Travis Scott stole the reverse swoosh idea from him, and maybe that's true, maybe it's not true. But this shoe was actually boring in comparison to what Dennis Rodman was like, but it's one that I think doesn't get enough love because Dennis Rodman and his weirdness doesn't really get the kind of love in terms of his basketball prowess as he should. He's in the Hall of Fame, obviously, but he's more known for the way that he was off the court than he was on the court. But this shoe, in my opinion, was really, really great. And I think it's one that I wish Nike would bring back and maybe even do some collabs with, because I honestly think that it's one that has a lot of potential. And the last shoe that we're going to talk about with Nike is the Nike Air Force Max. Now, this was designed for Chris Webber. Chris Webber from the Fab Five, again, a power forward who had high potential, never quite got there in the pros. I mean, he was a great pro, don't get me wrong. I think people had high aspirations for him in terms of being one of the best forwards ever. I think people kind of saw him as maybe being a Tim Duncan in that regard. When you go back and look at their careers, Tim Duncan is revered as one of the best to ever do it. Chris Webber was really good. Obviously, on those Kings teams, they almost went to the NBA championship, ran into Kobe and Shaq, but the Air Force Max just kind of had that look, and it predates all of these in the 90s except for the pump. But I love this shoe for the fact that it wasn't out there to make a statement. It was visually appealing, but it wasn't out there to make a statement. It really was designed for Chris Webber, but I don't think it was designed with his personality in mind. It was sort of the start of when the 90s really became about these shoes matching the player's personality and being a visual expression of them. And I think that is where a lot of this started. The pump, I think, was a visual representation of technology. I think the Air Force Max is when Nike started to realize, hey, let's start to design these shoes so that people associate them with these athletes because they will sell more. Those are all the shoes that I have highlighted here. There are so many more that I probably could, but before we get to the end, let's get to the release of the week. Release of the week, where I like to highlight a shoe that has caught my eye. It's not always hype, rarely is it. It's just one that I want you to know about. Circle your calendars for a New Balance release, June 13th, for a hefty price of $260. The New Balance 991 V2 made in England vintage sport colorway. It's clean. It's got cream with red, blue, gray accents, has premium materials. It's going to be a good fit. It's going to be comfortable. It's very versatile. It's going to go with a lot of different things. I think it's very important for people to have at least one New Balance in their collection, especially in the summertime if you're wearing more shorts. They're a great match of performance and fashion, and I think all of it kind of works. And this is a very, very subtle colorway. I know a lot of people gravitate toward the ones that are more loud, maybe like the Action Bronsons, but this is a nice addition. So if you're in the market for a 991, go ahead and pick this up on June 13th on New Balance's website and probably other places too. So how do you feel about the 90s in terms of basketball and in terms of their shoes? Do you feel like me that it is a era that actually is defined by these rivalries and is something that should be revered? Let me know by getting in touch with the show on Instagram at Fire Footwear Pod. You can find the show on YouTube, Fire Footwear, a sneaker podcast. I'd love to hear from you, love to connect with you. Let me know, make comments, get in the DMs on Instagram. I just love to connect with people, and it means a lot to me that this show touches people. Hope this finds everybody well. I hope this finds everybody safe. And as always, I'll talk to you next time. This is Fire Footwear. The opinions and viewpoints expressed on Fire Footwear are those of Matt Frates and his guest, and not necessarily those of the Matty Ice Media Network. Fire Footwear is exclusively owned by Matt Frates and is brought to you by the Matty Ice Media Network.